You know what I was thinking of in the beginning of our service? We sing Shalom Aleichem. We sing it every week. Lots of Jewish communities all over the world will sing Shalom Aleichem. And the idea of these angels that are being welcomed, and we know that they're going to be departing too as Shabbat begins, and we're always calling them ministering angels. Well, this idea of lesharet can be to minister, but it's to help. It's to serve. And when we think about what that means on Shabbat, I love the story about angels accompanying us on our walk to the synagogue and kind of hoping that everything is going to be beautiful Shabbat. It's kind of a sweet message from our rabbis of old. But I actually, the jury is out for me about angels. I confess. But the same word for angel is also a messenger. I believe God sent us. I kind of think it's that simple. I think God sent us to serve, to do, to minister, to help, to care. And we get to have joy, we get to have happiness, we get to have satisfaction. Maybe we'll even have a vacation. But we are here actually to care. And we forget that. I think there's a lot of times there's this sin of forgetting. There's a sin of complacency. And in the Jewish community, we have a hard time with saying a word out loud like sin. But it's true. Sin isn't something terrible. Sin is missing the mark. And hopefully we come here to sing, to pray, to connect to each other, to God. But it's also to kind of get realigned and figure out, who am I supposed to be? What does our tradition say? What's my inheritance? And how can I be a ministering angel, a messenger from God, instead of waiting for some other divine being to show up as if God doesn't already? The reason why I'm thinking about Shalom Aleichem and the idea of peace and shlemut and wholeness is because Rabbi Ruthie Gelfarb, who's on our clergy team here, of course, and many of you have studied Musar with her or taking other kinds of class or maybe participate in our contemplative Shabbat that happens Shabbat mornings once a month. It'll happen again tomorrow. Is it happening tomorrow? It's happening again tomorrow. Don't all show up. It's a small room. But she recently had a privilege in an important pilgrimage to go and be a witness and to engage in that lesharet, into this idea of service. And by going to the American border and with other groups, and she'll tell you about it. We've asked her to tell you, to preach to you tonight about what she witnessed. And the groups that brought her are two. They're coming together in collaboration. One is HIAS. A lot of us know about HIAS. Once upon a time, it used to be called the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. Once upon a time, perhaps a lot of our family was met by folks from HIAS to be welcomed and taken care of and ministered to in this country when it was our turn to escape oppression. There's not a lot of Jews going through HIAS these days. So they got rid of Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. Now it's just HIAS. The other group is a group called Truah. Truah is the call from the shofar, a call to action. HIAS and Truah brought different representatives in the Jewish community, and Rabbi Ruthie is going to tell us what she was a part of. Vakasha.
Right in front? Can you hear me? Great. Well, thank you first, Rabbi Green, for the opportunity to speak to the community about my recent trip to the U.S.-Mexico border. Thank you. I usually see everybody from the back because I sit near Estelle, so this is a totally different view. Wow. Jeez. So while tonight I'm going to be focusing on just a few of the places we went on our trip, this trip with about 15 rabbis, I want to share my itinerary with you so that afterwards, in the days and weeks ahead, you should feel free to come and ask me about anything that happened on this trip. On the Mexican side of the border, in Ciudad Juarez, we visited makeshift refugee encampments and a government-run Mexican shelter. On the U.S. side of the border in El Paso, we visited the border wall, a detention center, a migrant shelter run by a terrific faith-based organization, a federal trial, and several local nonprofits that are doing work on immigration and refugees issues. The purpose of the delegation was to bear witness to what is going on at the border to these modern-day sojourners, and it was a whirlwind 3.5 days. Our first day, we ventured to Ciudad Juarez, and as soon as we crossed the border into Mexico, we saw hundreds or perhaps thousands of people living on the streets in makeshift tents. There were adults and children, and they were crowded and standing on the dusty streets, not seeming really to be doing anything. And we asked, what's going on here? Why are they living like this? The highest lawyer who was accompanying us explained to us our government's current and relatively new policies. The folks we saw were under these two policies. One is called the Migrant Protection Program, and the other is the Metering Program. And the folks living on the streets are asylum seekers, and they're waiting for their number to be called. It's like a bakery. You get a number, and you wait. And folks are waiting months for their number to be called, as very few numbers are called each day. When your number is finally called, then you can begin the process of seeking asylum, and your claim will be processed. I'd like to share that at Ellis Island in the 1910s and 20s, when many of our grandparents and great-grandparents might have come through, it usually took just several hours or at most a couple of days to be processed to enter the country. By and large, the folks we saw were without resources. They didn't have the luxury of staying in a hotel or an Airbnb, and so they sleep on the streets in makeshift tents. Rather than referring to this program by its official name, the Migrant Protection Program, journalists refer to it as the Remain in Mexico program, and advocates refer to it as the Migrant Persecution Program. There are so many families living on the U.S.-Mexico border now that our border with Mexico has become one of the top 10 refugee camps in the world. We next went to a Mexican government-run shelter that houses families, primarily children and women, and the folks in the shelter were also part of the Metering and Migrant Protection Program. They're all waiting for their number to be called. And once that number is called, then they can properly request asylum and begin the process of asylum seeking. I don't know why some folks are on the streets and some folks are in shelters. I don't know why. A highest employee who was with our group and is a native of Mexico invited one woman, Elena, to talk with us. And she shared a story that at the time I found very hard to believe, and I'd like to share it with you tonight. Elena, who is from Honduras, was working for an American aid organization. And a local gang that was there didn't like that. So they put a mark on her daughter, her 14-year-old daughter, and Elena knew that that mark meant that she was a target for assassination. Fearing for their lives, Elena and her daughter left home on foot and walked through Mexico with the hope of seeking asylum in the United States. En route, she and her daughter were kidnapped and held captive for several weeks in a railroad cargo container. The kidnappers made repeated requests for her to contact family members for money. She shared over and over again that she just didn't have any money. Eventually, she and her daughter were released. They were very lucky. Yet, traumatized and suffering from PTSD, they continued to the U.S. border. Elena went through the metering program, and she waited several months for her initial meeting. She again was one of the lucky ones. They found that she had a credible threat in her home country, and so she could begin the process of seeking asylum, and she was returned to Mexico, where they now are in the shelter. Elena shared that she and her daughter will not leave the shelter because she has seen men associated with the gang that kidnapped her outside the shelter in Ciudad Juarez. The story seems so strange to me that somebody would, walk across their country, be kidnapped for ransom, then be stuck in a shelter because gang members potentially would harm them. Well, I came back to Boulder, and shortly after returning, I spoke to Ethan Stone, who some of you will wave, our youth director, and Ethan shared with me that he had spent 6 weeks this summer at the border of Guatemala and Mexico, and he said to me, "Oh yeah, Rabbi Ruthie, I heard lots of stories like that, even worse." Then I listened to the November 15th episode of Ira Glass's This American Life, in which the same kind of story was repeated, even worse. Apparently, some Mexican police have been implicated in working with the gangs to help kidnap and ransom the refugees seeking asylum. On the bus ride back to El Paso, I was reminded of our biblical injunction, the mitzvah, the sacred responsibility. You shall not oppress the sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. This mitzvah is repeated over and over and over again, and I think not only because it's so important, but because it's very easy to forget. And the mitzvah is phrased slightly differently in different parts of the Torah. In another section, it says, "You shall not oppress the sojourner, for you know the heart of the sojourner, as you were sojourners in the land of Egypt." Or perhaps, "You shall not oppress the sojourner, for you empathize with the feelings of the sojourner, as you were sojourners in the land of Egypt." I realized that I had lost touch with what it feels like to be a ger. Being on this delegation, hearing Elena's story, and seeing the families living in makeshift tents, I began to get back in touch with those feelings. I started to feel the despair, the fear, the vulnerability, the frustration, the exhaustion, the patience, the impatience, and even the hope. The next day, we visited the Otero Detention Center, a facility that houses over 1,000 men, and it is run by a privately owned company, very much like the detention center in Aurora, which is also privately run and which detains folks as they await the legal resolution of their asylum claims. Very few groups are allowed inside of detention centers. My colleague, a Lutheran minister, asked, "How did you all manage to get inside?" I have no idea. We just did. And this experience felt even worse than the one the day before. The oppressiveness of the system was palpable, and I had to keep reminding myself that the folks inside were not hardened criminals, because everything else suggested otherwise. And in retrospect, I wondered if perhaps this was designed with the hope that the detainees would just give up, abandon their claims, and immediately be sent back to their home countries. We were welcomed into the ICE detention facility by an ICE public relations officer, and the warden, Dora Orozco. And at the entrance, where the detainees come in, is a banner, and it says, "Bionic, believe it or not, I care." Yes, as the detainees come in, written in English, it says, "Believe it or not, I care," as they're about to be processed and remain in detention. We were escorted into a conference room, and Warden Orozco explained to us how things worked. She said the detainees are given the option of working, of using a law library, and going outside for 2 hours each day for recreation. She explained that the detainees can work in the kitchen, cleaning the facilities, or the grounds. They are paid $1 a day. Warden Orozco explained it's good for the guys to keep busy. It makes for less troubles. She also shared that corporate gave her $3 a day to feed each detainee. She is very careful to meet mandated caloric requirements. I think of the croissant I bought for $3.25 at the corner coffee shop. The detainees are permitted to make calls. International calls are 37 cents per minute, and domestic calls are 25 cents per minute. A 30-minute call to a lawyer would require you to work 8 days. Warden Orozco then proudly shared that the law library had 4 computers with LexisNexis. I don't know if anybody here's a lawyer. You're seeing some nods. And I wondered how these men, the majority of whom do not speak or read English well, would be able to research American asylum law and write their own briefs. Talk about a rock before a blind person. Visitation is allowed, however, there are no hugs and no hand-holding. All visits are non-contact and conducted through a glass partition. And what clothing your visitors can wear is also legislated. No midriff showing, no miniskirts, and no skin-tight clothes allowed. Warden Orozco emphasized that she is very careful to make sure that all ICE procedures and protocols are carefully followed. Next, we were escorted by the guards, all of whom, I met 3 of them and spoke with 3 of them, started working at the facility when they were 19 years old, right out of high school. And we were reminded that no photographs were allowed and we would not be able to speak with the detainees. Once again, I don't know why we were not allowed to speak to the detainees, but we weren't. And all the men inside were wearing orange tops and bottoms like prisoners do. And all the doors were locked, movement was limited, and it felt in every way like a prison. The guards opened a door, and inside we saw a large room with 20 bunk beds, and some men were walking around inside the room, and others were just lying on their beds. And I will never forget the one young man I saw lying and staring into space. He did not react to our presence. He looked so sad. His eyes looked empty. and my heart broke. And they were told that this is how most of the men spend their day. Our next stop was something called the Special Housing Unit. It's a euphemistic term for solitary confinement. And as we entered the area, the officers closed the windows to each and every cell so that we could not see inside the cells and the people in the cells could not see us. Well, one person started banging on the door. It was awful. And when we asked why would somebody be in solitary confinement, the warden was silent. And the ICE public relations officer responded, "Some folks simply prefer to be alone." The guards who were, like I said, they were just so young, and my heart broke for them. My heart really did break for them as well. The effects of this dehumanizing and oppressive detention center was even worse than I had imagined. The day after leaving the Otero Detention Center, I was shown a New Yorker magazine article that described hunger strikes and attempted suicide, the misuse of solitary confinement for those who speak up, and the forced feeding of hunger strikers. There was absolutely no mention of any of these problems during our visit. Friends, I want to share that viscerally. I now understand how the Red Cross could have walked through Theresienstadt and not known just how bad it really was. I know that the detention facility and the way that we are treating our asylum seekers is cruel. It's oppressive. It's traumatizing and exceedingly dehumanizing. The majority of asylum seekers, whether they are in Mexico or in Ciudad Juarez or in El Paso, are seeking a safer, better life. And I say this not as a Republican, not as a Democrat, nor as a policy expert. I say it as a rabbi and a human being. During the delegation, a fellow rabbi shared some texts with us about the biblical city Sodom. Another time I'd love to share some of these texts. They're just fabulous. Kind of nerdy rabbis talking, but fabulous. And the sages taught, this is a quote, "The people of Sodom became haughty due only to the excessive goodness that the Holy Blessed One bestowed upon them. The people of Sodom said, 'Since we have a land from which bread comes and has dust of gold, why do we need travelers, as they come only to take away our property? Come, let us cause the proper treatment of travelers to be forgotten from our land.'" Friends, I fear that we Americans, blessed with so much, have forgotten the proper treatment of travelers to our land. I fear not only for the soul of all those Gerim, all of those modern-day sojourners, but also for the souls of the men and women who are working in the immigration, asylum, and detention systems. My hope tonight is that each of you will be a ministering angel like the kind that Rabbi Green shared just a few minutes ago, and take some small step to address the asylum crisis and its oppression. No action is too small, and we have printed out a flyer that lists some opportunities, and our very own Lauren Park, who is the incoming chair of our Tikkun Olam committee, is happy to speak with people after and take down names if you're interested in finding out more. Thank you. Finally, I pray that we will be inspired and informed by our better selves and by the Statue of Liberty that awaited our grandparents and great-grandparents at Ellis Island. Proudly, Lady Liberty declared, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." Ken Yehi Ratzon, Shabbat Shalom.
There's so much more to say and do. Right now, let's turn to our conclusion. We can continue some of these conversations after